go ahead from someone. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining in. Hope everyone's keeping safe. Welcome to this first episode of our MBA application journey series, where we'll have conversation with MBA candidates from top business schools to really understand how they thought about their whole MBA application process. I'm Ayush. I'm a first-year MBA candidate at Columbia Business School. And having been in your shoes a couple of years back, I do think that this process can add a lot of value to your application journey. Just, hearing stories from people and really understanding how they approach different aspects of the application. So before I just introduce our guest speaker today, some general admin rules. I already have questions for our speaker, which I expect to cover in about 30 minutes or so. I would be taking all your questions at the end. So do send in your questions towards the end of the meeting. A small request, just try to be as specific as you can with the question that you're asking so that we can, cater to them in the best possible manner. So yes, we have with us today one of my very good friends and batchmate from Manipal, Vrinda Kalia. Vrinda is a second-year MBA candidate at Rice University. She also received an admit from ISB in India. Before Rice, she was a tech consultant for Deloitte for about 6 years. So welcome, Vrinda.
Thank you.
Great. So let's just get started with the few questions that I have for you. So Vrinda, would love to start it off with just understanding what were your primary motivations behind doing an MBA?
Oh, sure. Thank you. And I hope all of this is useful. And in case you think that people might need additional information, please feel free to keep me on track and let me know how I can add a little value to everyone who's tuned in today. So I passed out of Manipal. I did engineering from MIT Manipal, and I joined Deloitte Consulting. And I worked out of the Bangalore office for 3 years, after which I was offered a project in Los Angeles, which is why I moved. I was 6 years in. I'd been enjoying my work a lot, but then it was time to sit back and really reflect on why I started working in the first place. And I realized that while all this was great and I'd been having fun, I wanted to make a transition into something which was more rounded. So I was a tech consultant. I was doing implementation work, and I wanted to move a little upstream. I wanted to be a part of the decision making and truly thinking through what we were doing and what we wanted to implement and why we wanted to implement it, which is why I realized that in order to make any such transition, I would need to gain a set of skills. And an MBA seemed like the most, I wouldn't say easiest, but the most obvious path at that time. And that's what led me to beginning my research and to see whether an MBA is actually what will help me pivot into that direction and also open up a whole bunch of avenues for me. So that's what got me going down the MBA path.
Sure. And were there any other options that you were very seriously considering, or you were fairly certain on MBA being the path ahead?
So my long-term goal is to start an animal shelter because I'm super into animals. But then I realized that I didn't know the first thing about it. So I considered jumping into that directly, but I realized I couldn't skip these steps. And MBA seemed like my only thing that would help me do that. So I didn't consider anything else. It was an MBA only that I was going for.
Oh, okay, great. So the next thing I want to just ask you, Vrinda, is I know that you applied to ISB in India and you also got an admit from there, and you applied to a few schools in the US. So just really trying to understand, how did you go about identifying which business schools do you want to apply to, and what are the different factors that you consider, and also how did you just go about that process, right? By attending events, speaking to people, etc. Yeah.
That's a great question. And I think this is probably one of the most overlooked factors in the whole MBA process, because usually we tend to be we want to do an MBA, and we just go look up the top 10 schools and then start to see how we can tailor ourselves to applying to those schools. But I didn't do that because I was more of a realist with this regard. So what I did was that first I started talking to people. I do think that in your whole leading up to the GMAT, the research should be the longest part of what you're doing. So I started talking to people, and friends within my network or who I'd worked with earlier who'd made this transition to go to business school in the US or ISB and all these other places. And I started to talk to them to understand what are the few things that might make a school great for me. So the first thing I did by talking to them was list down a list of parameters that mattered to me the most. And I can probably name a few for example, in case that helps. So for example, I wanted a small class size because I'd done my undergrad at Manipal and my class size was like, I think 1,800 students, and I didn't even know who my batchmates were. I only knew you because you were in my section, but there are a whole bunch of people who are like, oh, did you go to this school in this year? But I don't even know about them because I never ran into them. So I wanted a small class size, which was a big criteria for me. That was one thing I started out with. And I wanted it to be affordable. So I know that a scholarship is a great option to reduce the tuition load, but I also wanted to make sure that the city had a cost of living which was not skyrocketing. So that's why I eliminated schools in the New York and like New York, New Jersey, and all those places. That was another criteria. Once I identified these parameters, I identified which schools fit the bill instead of doing it the other way around. So I made a list of schools. And then I decided that if my GMAT is amazing and I crush it, then these are the top 5 schools I'd apply to. If it was in a more lower range, then I'd apply to schools within my reach. And they'd be some schools which were like reaching schools where I'd just apply to it because just for the experience, essentially. And that's how I identified my schools. The next step was that I was lucky, and I know this was just pure luck that I happened to be in the US, that I could attend a lot of events and I could actually go to schools. I attended a few events at Emory and Rice University, and I could actually visit them on campus. And I think that really helps because sometimes you walk around the corridors and you see how the school feels, and sometimes that just speaks to you. And I feel sometimes we overlook this criteria because we feel the key is to get into a great school. But it's a very big decision because we're leaving our work and moving to a country if we're applying to the US. And it's 2 years we're going to be spending there. So we need to be picky about the school we go after. And we shouldn't go after any school that lets us in. We should choose what school we want to go into. So I attended a lot of info sessions. I'd always attend MBA seminars wherever they have them. And I know schools do this all over the country. They do it in India too. So I would recommend, like highly, highly recommend going to these conferences, talking to the the admission team people who come in from these schools. And they usually bring in some students also. And just talking to them and having a very open and honest conversation. I think all of these factors together helped me identify which were my top 5 schools that I wanted to apply to.
Sure, and I think that strategy does resonate really well. I think it's similar to the approach that even I took. And I think now just to address the elephant in the room, which is like something a lot of people want answers to, like how did you go about choosing between Rice and ISB? You got like admits from both these great schools and like 2 very different schools, I would say, like very credible in the respective geographies they are in. But yeah, like how was that process for you like?
So I think this is one of the toughest decisions I made. I think I agonized it for weeks, and I didn't think I slept a lot when I had to make this decision. But in the end, for me, it boiled down to 2 main things, I guess. It was a trade-off because ISB is like the best school in India, and growing up, I'd be like, "Ooh, maybe someday I'll go to ISB," and it was so huge to get an admit. But what tipped the scales was I got a scholarship from Rice, and I think that really helped offset some of the burden that I was apprehensive about, is what I would say. The other thing was the experience. I thought that having studied in India, maybe studying in the US would be very different. And yes, it has been extremely different. It's so different. So in class, people are nobody calls a professor always, like they don't address the professor as professor. It's super casual. In India, there's always like this difference, but over here, it's so conversational. So I think it's been an interesting experience. So it was the experience of being able to witness something that I never had was one reason why I chose Rice over ISB. And there's one more, actually. I just thought of it, the class size. Because Rice has like 120 students in totality. And having been through this over 2 years, I realized I know each of my classmates. So if someone says that I'm from the class of 2020, I'll know who they are. I know what they're like. I know what it's like to work with them. And since this is going to be a big part of my network, I think it's very valuable. It also has its cons, but I think it brings a lot of value to be a part of a smaller class.
Wow. And would have made a great choice, I think, for sure. So just talking about the other thing, I think, which a lot of students sort of are confused about, which is the MBA consultant and whether to hire them or not. And I know that you did not hire any MBA consultant. So would just love to understand a little bit about how you took that call.
Yeah, and this is again a very personal choice, and I don't think that one is better than the other. But in my case, I had done a lot of groundwork and a lot of research on the schools, as well as I was lucky in that a lot of my closest friends had already been through this exercise. Some of my friends had just passed through Emory and I think CMU and all these other schools, which is why I had a great pool of resources, and my support system was great, where I could run my essays by them, and I could review my stories with them and my interview prep. And only because I had done my research and I had a great support system I could rely on, I decided that I could forego the additional expenditure of hiring a consultant. And I think it's a very personal choice, and I do think that consultants bring in a lot of value. In my case, I had a strong support system I could rely on, which is why I decided at that point to not hire a consultant. And did you hire a consultant? You hired a consultant, so I guess you want to talk about that.
Yeah, exactly. So I, in fact, wanted to add on here and just double click on Vrinda's point about it being a very personal choice, because yes, I did end up hiring a consultant, and I knew even though it was a very high cost, I drew a lot of value from the whole experience. And at the same time, I know people who hired consultants and didn't find a lot of value in it. So I think it's just like you being able to lay out like what are the 3-4 areas that you specifically need help in, and then sort of weighing that with like whether a consultant will be able to add value or not. So I think, yeah, we can talk more about that, my consultant experience. So one of the other things that I just wanted to understand from you, and this is personally something that I struggled with the most, and this is about the short-term and long-term goals, because honestly, like before applying, like I honestly didn't know. Like one of the reasons I was doing an MBA was because I was like, I don't know what do I want to do like 3 years down the line, 5 years down the line. So would just love to understand a little bit about how you ended up like crafting your stories for both your short-term and your long-term goals.
I guess the one thing I want to start out with is we all had stories when we came into business school, and that's how we got in, because we had a clearly defined story. But the first thing we were told in our school is that don't worry about it. Like, it's not that people are going to hold you accountable. So, for example, if I said that I worked in healthcare, I was a consultant, I want to be a healthcare consultant because it all just made sense. If I went there and after taking 2 finance classes, decided that I wanted to move into corporate finance, no one's going to come and question you that, hey, why are you changing path now when you've like built this whole elaborate story on what you want to do? I think what the business school is, admission team at least, what they're looking for is coherence of thought. They want to know that you take logical decisions. You don't just do an MBA on a whim, that one day you're like, oh, my work is boring, maybe I need to do an MBA, because that's not what's going to make you successful. What's going to make you successful is if you've decided that, oh, I'm at A, I want to get to D, and I need to go through B and C in order to do so. So essentially, that's what we should keep in mind when we're trying to craft our stories, that they should be coherent and they should make logical sense. You can't say that I worked in a bank for 10 years and what do you want to do? I want to go into oil and gas. For no reason. You have to know that the industry appeals to me. I've done this in the past and all of that. So for short term, I feel your story should tie in more directly to your past experiences and how you're going to pivot. So there has to be some relation, because I think this is, and please correct me if I'm wrong on this, Ayush. They say you can't change your industry, your function, and your geography, all 3. You can change 2, something like that. So that's why your short-term goal should not be a complete 180 degree from everything you've been doing in the past. Yes, it can be a step up, it can be a transition, it can be a pivot. And for your long-term goals, you should tie that into how your past experiences, your MBA, and what you aim to achieve in your short-term goals all ties in together and maps a journey so that you can achieve your end long-term goal. Does that help? Should I elaborate on anything?
Yes, absolutely. And I think I cannot specify this enough, like what you've just said, is that ultimately where you are right now, your short-term goals, your long-term goals, and also the MBA in the middle, it has to logically flow. Like why an MBA will help you get to the short-term goal, why your short-term will help you get to your long. So I think as long as it's realistic, it's something that you're truly passionate about, and it all sort of flows in well. I think that's one of the big things that the admissions team is looking for. So
I
thanks
agree.
for that.
Yeah.
One of the other things, again, like after speaking to candidates, and one of the things that they struggle with the most is about the leadership stories in the essays. And most schools ask about like one of their biggest leadership examples, even if it's not worded in that sense. And I think a challenge that people face is they typically come up with multiple stories. So how do you identify that one or two most important stories that you want to write an essay about?
I guess the first thing and foremost thing is to not make up stuff. You can't fabricate a story because people will see right through it. You can't say that, oh yeah, I saved Earth one day and that's how I'm an amazing person. You need to come up with your stories based on what you've done all throughout your working life or whatever you're most proud of. And once you've identified a set of stories, I think the next step is to run it by a few people, because we're so married to our stories because we've experienced them. We can't differentiate between them, and we just assume that, oh, this is understood, and oh, everybody knows what this is, like acronyms, because we're from India and we understand what it's a well-known name. Sometimes we tend to not make great stories because we're too close to the story. So I think once you identify a set of stories, you should run it by a few people. And I guess before you do that, one step is, how I spoke about earlier, that you identify a list of parameters and see which schools match those parameters. You should see what kind of principles the schools care about and whether your stories are actually portraying those principles, because every school has a personality, in my opinion, and you can tell, like if you've spoken to enough people at the school, done enough research, you can tell what the school cares about and what the school's personality is. And the stories that we identify should factor those in, should talk about those or touch upon those things that students have spoken about. So if it's like, oh, close-knit community, so you know that if you talk about working across teams in a collaborative way and everything, that will resonate more with them. Next step is to run it by a bunch of people. And you should always, it's very important to have a support system that's actually valuable, and you're not running it by people who haven't been through the exercise. You have to identify people who've actually experienced this themselves, been through it, and who've actually been through business school, so that they can tell you what your stories really convey and where the gaps are. And I will say at this point, your GMAT is the only thing you do by yourself, but you need to rely on a support system. You need to have a group of people who are like your sounding boards. You can run things by them. You can ask them if they see in a story what you want to convey. And you need to take feedback constantly from people. And I guess this is where the value of a consultant comes in case you don't have such a network of people you can rely on. So to identify the leadership stories, I would say look at your parameters, look at this, based on that, look at the schools. Based on that, see if your stories are touching upon those principles that each school talks about. Feedback on your stories is pivotal, I guess, and your stories need to be rehearsed but not learned, because people can see through them if they're not genuine or if they're over rehearsed.
Sure. And I think one of the things very rightly put together, and I think one of the things that I just want to pick up on is just the point about how every school is very unique, and ensuring that the stories that you're putting in your essay sort of caters to some, like, the principles that the schools live by. And like, believe it or not, like, all these schools are different. Like, they all swear by different principles. And really, I remember, like, in my case, one of the schools that I was applying to, they were very fast on the impact that you create on others more than what you've done for yourself. So, like, just positioning your stories in a way that you can really demonstrate how the work that you did, like, had an impact on people around you, like not just like work impact, but also personal impacts. And I think really picking on that hue is something which is very important. So great. I think one of the sure.
Sorry to interrupt you. I just thought of one thing which I think often gets overlooked. When you're preparing your stories, I think we should always think about our failure stories, because I feel that's not stressed upon and it's not always asked in MBA applications. But I've seen that in the interview processes, it does get asked. And I think your failure story says a lot about you, which is why even if it's not in the essay, I would absolutely prepare for a failure story, because they want to see the human side of you. They don't want to see someone who always gets it right, who always does wonders, but someone who has made a mistake and how they've actually dealt with it. So I would say that when everyone's preparing their stories, a failure story is a big part of something that we should keep in mind.
Sure. Perfect. That's great. The next thing that I want to discuss with you is about recommenders. So I think a lot of people face this dilemma of who are the recommenders that they should pick, and from which firms should they pick if they've worked in multiple firms. So we'd just love to understand a little bit about how you went about that process.
Yeah. So I'd worked only at one firm, which is why my pool of potential recommenders was smaller. But I was lucky in the sense that I had I was very transparent with my manager, and he knew that I was looking at business schools. And because I was in the US, it was easier for me to do that. I will say when it comes to recommenders, because most of us are working in India, our managers are all Indian. And the one thing is the cultural difference when it comes to writing a recommendation, because it's just something we're not used to. Our managers might not be used to. So to identify your recommenders, I will say the first thing is to identify someone who's worked with you in a supervisory capacity, so that they're a little objective in judging you. They can see what your strengths are, where your weaknesses lie. But of course, we want to focus on the strengths in this primarily. So you should identify someone who's worked with you and who would be able to articulate your strengths and weaknesses clearly. And this is where the cultural thing I was talking about comes in, because our managers have usually just done our project evaluations, and they're used to saying, oh, this guy he met expectations, he's okay. But a recommendation has to be glowing. And that's not something my recommender, one of my first few recommenders I picked, was doing really well. It was a lukewarm recommendation, but from his side, it was a glowing one, but it didn't come across as one. And I think once you've identified a recommender who you think is on the same page as you should have an open line of communication with them, where you tell them, hey, look, I'm applying to this school. I need a good recommendation. So if there is something you think I have weaknesses, talk to me about them. But I think these are the strengths I have, and discuss with them, have an open discussion on what kind of strengths you want to portray and what they should talk about. Because if you're writing a bunch of strengths in your essay, your recommender can't be listing out a completely different set of strengths. They both should complement and reinforce each other, which is why identify a recommender who's worked with you in a supervisory capacity and who you can have an honest conversation with. It shouldn't be a recommender who writes his own thing and says, yeah, I'll submit it without showing it to you. You should have a role in at least reading it, if not influencing it, at least reading it and judging whether you want to keep it or you want to do away with that and find a new recommender.
Sure. And Vrinda, just a sub question on this, and this is something personally that I struggled with a little bit, was obviously there are these immediate supervisors, your managers that you've worked very closely with, and the first option that comes to your mind is obviously have them write your recommendation. But there are also these slightly more senior people, like your manager's manager, with whom you haven't worked very closely with, but obviously they are way senior up in the organization, and a recommendation from them could probably add more value just from a credibility perspective. So did you face such a dilemma, and if yes, how did you decide between the two options, which one should I pick?
I guess it varied, because I did reach out to my senior manager for one of my recommendations, which was because I thought it would carry more weight to it. But you have to realize that if you're reaching out to a senior person, the time they'll be able to devote to the recommendation might be lesser. And sometimes a manager who you work more closely with, who might be not as high up in the company, might be able to give you more time and make it an iterative process. But I will say that if it's a senior person, yes, totally. If you have the kind of equation with them where you can reach out to them, explain your goals, you have to identify who's going to be a champion for your cause. And if you think your senior manager is going to be supportive, and you can have that conversation with him to ask for a letter of recommendation, you should absolutely do that, because it shows that it conveys a lot, because it shows that you have the ability to work with people who are in higher positions. You have a relationship with them, you can communicate with them, you can convince them to write you a glowing letter of recommendation even when you're leaving the firm. So I will say that it speaks volumes. So if that's an option, absolutely. But if that's not always possible, so go for your manager. And if you can't let your manager know that you plan to leave, identify someone who's a level up, who's worked with you in some sort of, you've reported to them for something or the other, so that they can write a reflective letter of recommendation for you, and it's not just words put together. Also, in case I know some people did this where they couldn't disclose it at their workplace that they were planning to leave for their MBA till they had an admit in their hand, you can reach out to heads of organizations where you volunteered in the past. So, like, I used to work with this hospice near my house in Bangalore, and I actually considered reaching out to one of their workers because I used to volunteer there, because even they can convey a lot. And such a letter of recommendation adds a lot of color to your application, because it shows that you care about other things, and it's a more rounded person. I guess that's what comes across.
Right, perfect. And I think just picking up on one of those things that you shared, where if you ever have to make a trade-off between, like selecting your immediate supervisor who you think can write a great recommendation versus, picking someone who's way senior up and probably won't be able to add as much richness to the recommendation. The advice that I heard from a lot of people was always go for the content of the recommendation. Yes. Over who is writing it, because like the admissions committee really wants to see how well is your recommender recommending you, as opposed to just seeing that, okay, like this is a very senior, very credible organization, and not caring too much about the content about the. So that's just a piece of advice that I also heard from people. So I think you did touch upon some of the things on the interview, like when you were talking about your essays and like how you went about them. But I think specifically, I would love to understand a little bit about how the interview experience was between Rice and ISB, and how did you actually practice for your interviews?
Yeah. So for ISB, both my interviews for Rice and ISB were both virtual, because I was in the US when I was interviewing for ISB. So for ISB, the interviewees, I think, are not current students, but they're past students. At least that was in my case. I don't know if that's what it is. The overall interview was great. Like, I really enjoyed myself. If you walk out of an interview feeling good about yourself, then I think that's a win, even if you don't get an offer from them. The interview was great. So they just asked, it was very conversational. We always think that an interview is going to be like this serious thing where you're like, yeah, this is what I've done. But that's not what it was like at all. It was extremely conversational. They were asking me about, who my heroes are, what I care about. It wasn't anything very unexpected. Like, they didn't throw me a curveball where I was like, oh man, I've never thought about this. And it was straightforward question that we're all prepared for. But you should have, I would say, don't have one odd story, and like have a variety of stories that you can rely on and fall back upon. Because what if they ask you for a failure story, and then they ask you for a time you faced a challenge and you overcame it, something like that. So you should have backup stories also, in my opinion. For Rice, the interviewees was a current student. So for ISP, I had two interviewers, but for ISP, I had two interviewers, and for Rice, I had one interviewer, and the interviewer was a current student. So that current student, I think, now that I think about it in retrospect, because I've taken a few interviews too, after having been through the whole process at your MBA, when you're recruiting, like you're interviewing people to come and be potential colleagues or students of the school, there's a whole bunch of things you look for. And you see if overall they'll be a good fit in a classroom, because that these are people you could be sitting next to, or you could have been sitting next to 2 years ago, which is why it's very interesting. You have to come across as a good person and not like a competitive, hyper competitive person, unless it's the school that you're interviewing for, where they value competitiveness a lot. So like, if I give the example of Rice, super small school, the biggest emphasis is laid on teamwork and collaboration, and how they say Rice is nice. That is true, because people are very friendly and very open, and that's why I think that's one big quality they look for in all the students that they interview. When it comes about preparing for it, just like seek constant feedback on your stories. Run your stories by people who've been through the process, because they know what's what, and they can ask you pointed questions. Or I guess the one thing is that we are very verbose by nature. We love to explain things in tenses when one will do. And the more you practice with people, the more you refine your story, and you can convey what you want to in like 7 words instead of 50. So I guess the best thing is to practice, but not over rehearse. I remember when I had started out, I'm shy as a person, so I didn't want to interview or do mock interviews with people till I had everything locked down. But I don't think one should do that. But even if you're not prepared, just do mock interviews with people, because that's how you learn. When you're put on a spot with a question that you've never heard of before, you think you'll improvise and you'll be like, oh, that's a very good way to put it. So I'll say, even if you're not ready for it, just give mock interviews, practice enough, and hone your skills, be concise, and I think that's what works in an interview. And be chill, be casual. If you're too nervous, you can see. And I will say one tip. I've seen people when they're interviewing virtually, you can see their eyes darting towards notes. Like if I'm talking to you and I'm suddenly looking here and I'm saying something, you can tell that I'm looking at notes. So don't do that, is what I would say.
Yeah, I think I just want to add that, like, I think I did about like 3 or 4 MBA interviews, and all of them were some of the best interview experiences that I've had, because again, it never felt like an interview. It always just felt like a conversation. They wanted to know about what I want to do after an MBA. Why do I want to? And it just felt like the chat that I'm having with you right now, which just doesn't really feel like an interview. So I think, yeah, overall, very pleasant experience. Don't overthink it. That would be like my big advice for that. Just a couple of more questions, and I think then we can take questions from our audience. So I think the next one, Vrinda, just reflecting on the overall experience, if there were like 3 or 4 things that you could have done differently, like just reflecting on the whole journey, like what would those 3 or 4 things be?
Okay. Maybe I can start thinking of a few.
Sure.
The first one that comes to mind is it's all encompassing, which is talk to more students at the school. I can't stress upon how important it is, because we can research, we can read up online about schools, we can read rankings, but what you gain by talking to people who are actually going through the process is unparalleled in all senses, because you can ask about if their MBA experience has been what they expected it to be, if what is the thing that surprised them the most. And if I talk more about like US-based schools, because that's what I know about, I will say it's very different from like an Indian MBA, because I think there's no placement concept as such. It's mostly you network, you're put in a room full of people. If you're and you have to like go talk to people and give your pitch over and over and over again. So if you're a shy person, talk to some shy person who's been through the process about how they overcame it. I remember how awkward networking events were when we just started out our MBA, and it just helps to talk more and more to people. And the more you talk to people, you can see what kind of recruiting happens at their campuses, what kind of companies come. I feel in the race to get into a school, we don't lay enough stress on what we're going to do after our MBA. We have like one dream company, but like what are the odds of truly getting into that one dream company that you have? So you need to make a list, and you need to see if those companies visit your school, if your school has access to them. There are some schools that are feeder schools to some companies, because like some executive really high up in that company has been to that school, has studied there, so it automatically creates a very long lasting relationship. So like talk to as many students as you can. It's underrated how important it is. And I think that is one thing I would do. I would talk to like probably 10 students at a school, like different ones, so that you don't eat up too much time from each student. But you should definitely have a conversation with them, and you will be amazed at how open people are to having a conversation. Because like I said, having been through the MBA experience, you realize that it's not a one-man show. You need to have a group of people who are helping you, giving you feedback and advice along the way. So talk to as many people as you can. Like, don't be shy, reach out to people. People are nicer than we give them credit for. And I think the other thing is that create a longer list of parameters that you care about. Usually rank is where we stop and we're like, oh, it has a great rank, I'll just go there. But instead of that, like truly see what school matters to you. So if you want a school where there's not like people aren't too cutthroat and they're actually like collaborative and it's friendly and it's a safe space, then choose accordingly. And again, ties back to talking to more people to understand that. So I think these are the 2 things I would change just to get a more realistic picture of what to expect once you come to business school, because it's too many things that change at once. You're talking to strangers on a daily basis. You're setting up coffee chats with people you don't know, which seems unheard of otherwise. So I guess just to become familiar, just do more research.
Great. Last one from my end. How's your experience been at Rice so far? And you're graduating in May, and love to know a little bit about what you plan to do after that.
Yeah. So it's been great that let me start with that. In my first semester, I thought it was the longest semester of my life, the longest 4 months, because it was constant, like finance what, accounting what, and you're networking in parallel. You're trying to apply for internships and you're trying to make friends, but the people are like, oh, is he really my friend? Like it's personally and mentally, you're going through a lot. But after that, once things fall into place, time passes by too fast. It's been great at Rice so far. Our class size is small, which has been great because I actually know all of my classmates, which has been so much fun. So I think 10 of us went to Dell I interned at Dell last summer. So 10 of us were there and all of us would hang out with each other all the time because we knew each other so well. I saw people from other schools where Dell was the first time they were meeting each other, which is what I was talking about, a smaller class size being a great attractive factor for me. Overall, the professors are great. I have loved being here so far. I think it's very warm. So right now, all our classes are online because of the virus and everything, because we're quarantined. And our class just finds a way to meet every day. Like we always have happy hours over Zoom. We have like virtual workouts together. One of our classmates is teaching us how to bake. So I think it's been great. It's the class that really makes up your MBA experience to a large extent. And I feel that I had a great class. I was very lucky and I've loved it so far. And Houston's great also, is what I should say, because I've been here for 2 years and I don't want to leave Texas at all.
And did you talk about what you're planning to do post MBA?
Oh yeah, I'm going to be in Texas post MBA. So after my internship at Dell is based in Austin, which is like 2.5 hours from Houston in Texas. And I accepted my offer from Dell. So that's where I'll be going. Starting July, I'm going as a product line manager. It all falls under their marketing umbrella, but I'll be looking at product line management after this.
Wow, Dell sounds great. Great place to be at.
No, thank you.
Great. I think now I'm going to quickly switch to questions. We have a bunch of questions here, Vrinda, and I think I'm just going to showcase them on the screen and I'll also read out to them. So I think first one is from Jeet.
Okay.
And let me just put it on the screen. Yeah. So Jeet wants to, can you see the question written on the screen?
I can.
Yeah. So it's, let me also just read it out to other readers. So does working in a mid to small size company affect our chances like a lot to like top business schools? And what is your say on that?
So I know that an assumption is that if we worked at a big company, which people automatically know about, it increases our chances. But that's not true, because they want people from a diverse background. We should realize that they want a class which has a good personality overall. They want people from all walks of life who've had all different varying experiences. And what they're truly looking for is if we've shown growth and initiative at the companies we worked at. So working for a mid to small size company doesn't impact or is not negative in any way at all. If we've done great work, if we've been getting promoted on a frequent basis, if we've taken up a lot of initiative and shown demonstrated leadership qualities at these companies, I think that's what they're actually looking for. So I don't think it's a bad thing at all to work for a company that no one's heard of.
Sure. So I think next question from Bobby, and I think I kind of know the answer to this, but did you look for European business schools? I don't think you did, but like, how did you think about that?
I did not, but I do know that there are a bunch of schools that are very great, and a lot of people apply to like those few schools. So I don't think I'd be the best person to answer this, but there's no reason. It was a personal choice. I didn't discount them or anything. I just wanted to be here because I have some family in the US.
Sure. I think next question, which a lot of people worry about, is their academic scores. I think Piyush wants to know if a low academic score will be a huge block in achieving, like getting admission to a top business school. And I think he's mentioned his 10th and 12th grades, and there's also his BE GPA, or I think it's a percentage. So yeah, what was your say overall on your academic scores?
I don't think it makes or breaks any decision at all, because it's more recent. You have like 7 years of experience in the energy sector, which is awesome. And I would just focus upon that. You should focus on what kind of things you've done, what kind of like leadership traits they talk about that you've demonstrated, and what kind of transferable skills that you can bring to the class and also for your future job. So I wouldn't worry at all about, in fact, this is 10th and 12th. And oh yeah, the BE is mentioned. So even if you have a low GPA, I don't think it breaks anything. You just focus on your strengths and the kind of work that you've done. That will offset any of the other focus that might go onto your grades.
Sure. So I think we have another question from Jeet, where he's asking if business schools look for candidates that can handle their curriculum. So does certifications like CFA or CPA help students give a notch up in their profiles?
I would think it helps because, again, it ties into the kind of industry you want to get into post your MBA. It does also show, even if you want to make like a transition of industry, it does show and demonstrate expertise in your earlier industry that you were in. So I do think it's great because it shows specialization and expertise. So I think if you don't have it, I wouldn't like lose sleep over it, but having it is definitely a plus.
Sure. I think next, it's a very interesting question by Rajinder. So how is the COVID situation going to affect MBA admissions? And again, like we're going to be guessing here because both Vrinda and I won't really know too much of what's happening. But like, how do you think it's going to affect MBA admissions and job prospects, especially for 2020 applicants?
So if I'm going to take the job prospects first, because that's easier. So I think if students start their MBA right now, we all hope optimistically that things will settle down and get back to normal by 2022. I think it's the class of 2020 who is graduating right now who are a little worried because a lot of companies are pushing out all their recruiting and all their jobs to a later date when things are back to normal. So I think job prospects, this is all my personal opinion, of course. I think job prospects would be fine, would not get hampered severely or anything. MBA admissions, I don't think they're going to stop or anything, but I think schools might try and find a way around it. Like they might have the first few weeks are online or a relaxation when you can come. If it's the US schools or India schools also, they'll probably start online and then eventually say come to school or something like that. So I'd be curious to see how things play out.
Sure. So I think someone also asked if Vrinda hired an MBA consultant. She did not, so I'm not going to post that. Another question from Rajinder, I think it's a good one, where he says that if somebody has already changed their industry, like they worked in manufacturing and then changed it to banking, how does that sort of play into your MBA application process?
I guess changing before it is fine if you can explain why you did it. And I know on a resume, it's tough to explain it, which is why I've heard a lot of schools recommend that they always have an optional essay to clarify anything that might be a red flag or just something a admission of person might wonder, like, why I wonder why this happened. So I would just explain why this happened and tie it into what your future plans are. Switching industries is not a bad thing at all, as long as you can justify it. It might be like a passion for banking, or maybe I took an online course and I realized that this is my true calling and this is something that I would really be good at, and that's why I made this switch and I want to continue working in this. I think that's a perfectly logical and understandable explanation for switching industries.
Sure. I think a lot of people are asking about GMAT preparation. So I think I just want to tell them that there is a separate series by e-GMAT, which completely focuses on GMAT prep. And I think as part of these series, we're not focusing on that aspect at all. So I'm not going to necessarily dive into that. I think one of the other questions, which I think is relevant, is I think what Roh wants to know here is how to identify schools with scholarships. So I think, is there any way to sort of know beforehand, like where you're more likely to get a scholarship, and is that something that you thought about?
So I spoke to people because when I was speaking to students at Rice, they told me that Rice is very liberal with their scholarships, and that was a big reason I applied here. But I think all schools have a scholarship. I think I don't know if I found any information online on it. Like no school will say get up to 40% scholarship for a GMAT of 720. They don't say that. But if you talk to people and the current international students at the school, you can get a sense of what's what. So I would say just like talk to a few people and see, like Google it. I think you can tell that some schools have a reputation of like having more scholarships. And just one thing, Ayush, I noticed there were a few questions about work experience. Do you think that is something we should touch on?
Sure. So are you looking at questions which are more recent? Just one second.
I don't know. Like I was just popping up and I noticed that people were, I just found maybe if it helps anybody, there is no hard and fast rule on the number of years one should have of work experience. they look more as what you've done while you've been working. Have you shown or demonstrated any skills that set you apart or show that you're an achiever more than anything else? The one number that I've heard is 3 years is what people usually look at. Like it's just like a number that keeps popping up because some companies have a minimum 3 years work experience. But I will say there's no hard and fast rule on it, because I do have classmates who came straight out of undergrad because they did like super cool things, like started their own company or were training for the Olympics and all of those things. So no hard and fast rule on your age. The only thing is, if you have a lot of years of experience, maybe a full-time MBA is not the best path. Then you should explore professional and executive MBA options.
Sure. I think I'm just going to take a couple more questions. I know there are a lot of them, but I think due to time restrictions, we won't be able to do too many of them. I think one here which could be relevant. So Shweta wants to know what parameters could be considered for a 1 year versus a 2 year course, because I know ISB is 1 year and Rice is 2 years. So was that also one of the factors that helped you push more towards Rice?
In retrospect, yes, it was, because I did my internship in a tech company and I'd been working for a consulting company all throughout. So the biggest advantage of a 2 year course is that you get to do a summer internship. And the summer internship is like a trial run for you. So you switch an industry and you see if that's something you really would like to do in the long term. Because I've seen some people coming back from, like, I'm just using an example, like an investment banking internship, and they're like, man, that's too much for me. I thought I always wanted it, but I can't do it because it's too demanding for me. So I guess that's one big thing. If your goal is to switch industries, a 2 year course is a safer bet, because you get to try out before you make that switch, because there's only so many times you can switch or reinvent your career. So I guess we should factor that in.
Sure. And I think just one last question, Vrinda. This is not specifically from anyone, but I think I've been seeing a lot of themes around this, which is around your extracurricular activities. And how do you think the school the admissions committee sees that as a relevant experience, or do you think it builds to your profile? And if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and this is my personal opinion and based on what I've researched. I think it helps to show that you have an interest in things other than your work and your curriculum. But again, nothing is a deal breaker at all. If you show that there's a cause you care about, or there's something that you're very passionate about, it helps set you apart a little bit, because we all come from a pool of similar people where our paths have been, we did engineering and then we worked in technology and now we're going for an MBA. So if you have something like that, it shows you have a rounded personality and it sets you apart. I think these two things just help create a stronger case and make it an interesting read for admissions people who've been reading applications over and over again. But I don't think if you don't have anything, don't make up stuff or don't do something just for the heck of it. Like, find something you truly care about. If you want to put it on your resume, like, do it instead of just showing it, putting it, because people can see through it. And that's that.
Sure. Okay. Yes, absolutely. I think with that, I'm going to end the session. Thank you so much, Vrinda. I think we do have some more questions. I think people can just reach out to either me or e-GMAT, and we can direct you to Vrinda if you have some more pressing questions. But really want to take this opportunity to thank you, Vrinda, for taking the time out. And I'm sure this is some very useful thoughts that you've shared and will definitely help a lot of people.
I hope so. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Great, thank you. One last thing. Thank you so much, everyone, for signing in. I think it was a great session, first one that we did in this series. There are 7 more that we're doing as part of the series. So next one up, which is next Monday, same time, is with Vishesh Parnerkar, another very good friend of mine. He's at Chicago booth and is again graduating this May. So again, expect that one to be another great one. So stay tuned, and I'll see you next Monday for that session. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Vrinda. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Stay safe, everyone.